I don't want your success story. I want your fiasco and the fact that you made it through. So when I think about comedy and improvisation, I think about mess and struggle and hard stuff and the ability to navigate through it and laugh our asses off.
Okay, welcome back or welcome to the Finding Mastery podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Gervais, by trade and training a high-performance psychologist. And I am thrilled to welcome Kelly Leonard to the podcast for this week's conversation. If you've ever appreciated the comedic stylings of talents like Tina Fey or Stephen Colbert or Amy Poehler or Seth Meyers, you may want to give today's guest some credit. As the executive director of learning and applied improvisation at Second City, the world's premier comedy theater and school, Kelly Leonard has spent over 20 years shepherding the kind of creativity and collaboration that not only catapults comedy legends, but has the power to transform people's lives. Turns out, improv isn't just good for laughs. Looking at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation, Kelly helps not just build performers, but leaders, innovators, and everyday professionals develop transformational skills in business using the yes and principle, mastering the art of co-creation, leading by listening, and innovating by making something out of nothing. Like improv, life is not scripted. The more tools we have to navigate it, the better. So whether you're ready to laugh or learn or cry or a bit of all three, you're going to love hearing the insights in this remarkable conversation. So with that, let's jump right into today's conversation with Kelly Leonard. Kelly, I am stoked to learn from you today, and just a sincere thank you for coming on the podcast with us. But before we dive into your insights, can you just set the scene for our audience and explain what Second City is, your roles there, and then please feel free to name drop all of the amazing people that you've been able to work with. But so can you just give us a flyover?
Yeah. So maybe we can do this. I can sort of tell you my story at Second City and we'll explain what Second City is through that. Because my first gig at Second City was in 1988. I had just graduated college and I got a job here as a dishwasher. And the other guy who got hired that week to be a dishwasher was a guy named Jon Favreau, who would go on to direct some pretty famous films. We also both had mullets, and my wife has photographic evidence of such. So Second City is a sketch.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
I can see where we're starting already. We're starting with mullets.
Starting with mullets.
You and John in the kitchen.
Washing the dishes.
This is perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right.
With a bunch of Yale sociopaths and alcoholics. I mean, Second City is a renowned sketch and improv theater. It started in 1959. And so when I showed up, it was legendary in Chicago and nationally. And we had a theater and still do in Toronto. And we produced a television show called SCTV. And people mostly know us as a place that sort of is home to the first jobs of all these famous comedians. So when I was washing dishes, Mike Myers and Bonnie Hunt and Joel Murray were all on the main stage. Jane Lynch was in our ETC stage, our second stage. And then a couple guys named Tim Meadows and Chris Farley had just been hired into the touring company here. And the way Second City is set up, I don't know if people know this, but we do 2 acts of scripted content, the review, and a third act almost every night that's fully improvised. And that's where the cast is just taking suggestions from the audience and making what appears to be magic happen on stage. And lots of celebrities will join up. It was not uncommon for Robin Williams to stop by almost every month and perform with the cast in the improv set. And the improv set's free. So, broke college students are coming to this and getting to see world-class talent. And the thing is, it appears to be magic. And then you work here for a while and you realize there's a sort of improvisational pedagogy that is going on that all our performers are steeped in, that they learn. And what I sort of figured out is that improvisation is not magic. It's like yoga for your social skills. I often say it's like loud, noisy group mindfulness, right? It's a practice in being unpracticed, which is the way all of us walk through the world. So the very first company was spitting out people like Mike Nichols, Elaine May, Alan Arkin, Barbara Harris. Then you've got people like Peter Boyle and Joan Rivers and Robert Klein and Fred Willard. And then the group in 1969, which called itself the Next Generation, included John Belushi and Harold Ramis. And then you've got John Candy, Gilda Radner, Catherine O'Hara, Eugene Levy, George Wendt, Jim Belushi, Bill Murray, Betty Thomas. And I actually was lucky enough to graduate from washing dishes. I hosted the room, I worked in the box office, and I actually became the producer of Second City. So I got to hire a bunch of great talent. And I started out in 1992 doing that. And my first cast included Stephen Colbert, Steve Carell, and Amy Sedaris. I hired Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, worked with Mike Myers, worked with Seth Meyers, Jason Sudeikis, Cecily Strong, just Keegan-Michael Key, a host of incredible people. Jordan Peele, who I tried to hire, kept getting other gigs, and he actually worked on the bar staff here. So it's just always been this place where budding talent is playing and learning and growing, and we have a school, and we work with corporate groups and do all kinds of stuff. But at its heart, it is an improv-based comedy theater.
Okay, so that you've been around
A little bit.
And yeah, well, I wonder where you're going to take that. But I was going to finish it with, you've been around greats.
Yeah.
Like all-time greats in the comedy world.
You might call them masters.
Like deep,
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so let's start with just like unscientific approach to your subjective experience, which is if you just, let's imagine that, we're at the, dining room table, and you've had a couple cocktails, and you just kind of push the seat back a little bit, and you go, I between Tina, Stephen, Robin Williams, Sudeikis, Jon Favreau, like, you know what the common theme is? What would you say? And I don't think there is a common theme.
Oh, there is.
But like, what would you say?
No, there is.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely.
Let's go.
100%. All of these people
Nice.
are trained in the art of improvisation. So it is a embodied study, essentially, of human behavior. That might surprise some people, and it might not if they actually knew the origin story before 1959. So indulge me just a little bit. But there was a woman by the name of Viola Spolin, and she was a social worker in the 20s and 30s working at Jane Addams Hull House on the south side of Chicago. And her job was to better assimilate young people and immigrants into her care. And so she had worked with a woman called Neva Boyd, and they'd been playing around with theater games. And so what Viola did was kind of create this whole new suite of games, improv exercises, many of which were in silence or gibberish because the kids didn't always share language. But what they did was they came together and played, and it taught them to listen, to empathize, to cooperate, to collaborate. Her son, Paul Sills, was studying at the University of Chicago, and he loved these games, and he taught them to his friends, people like Mike Nichols and Elaine May, among others. They formed the first improvisational theater in America called the Compass Players in 1954, and that turns into the Second City in 1959. So the origin of this stuff was a way to get kids from disparate backgrounds who are scared and everything's new and they're navigating complexity. And it was like, oh, I know how we can get them better or quite frankly, kind of, I think, turn them into sort of superstars is by having them practice these elements in a gamified situation with embodied skill building. And that stuff also makes great comedy. It produces truth, which is really at its heart what most great comedy is. And it has this other aspect to it, which is very pro-social. And I think if you look, no one got into comedy because they're well-adjusted. That is not a reason people enter these doors. But what these skills do teach these individuals, these sometimes broken individuals, is how to work well with others. And when they share that language, they don't want to ever do it differently. So when I sort of listed off that huge name of Second City alums, if you trace where their careers went, Second City people went with them. Whether it's Cheers, Mary Tyler Moore, 30 Rock, Parks and Rec, writers, actors. Everyone's bringing the Second City people with them because they know that they have a shared language and a shared set of values. So one of the things in improvisation is your job is to save the person across from you, and you know their job is to save you. So if you are going into these very high pressure situations and you know that this person has got your back and you've got theirs, why wouldn't you want to be working with that person?
So the golden thread that you're talking about is that they have had this embodied skill building study.
Yes.
And they're practicing. And so I want to break that apart.
Yes.
Embodied meaning it's visceral, it's cognitive, it is physical.
Yes.
And so, right?
Yes.
Is that what we're, okay, so
Yeah.
we're talking about the same thing. So there's an embodied skill building.
Mm-hmm.
And that skill, I'm going to leave it blank for right now, but you're talking about practicing in an embodied approach, which is essentially what sport practice is.
Sure. Yeah.
But this practice that you're talking about, like skill building, right, in sport, but what you're talking about here is that the skills are designed to work well with others.
Yeah. And what's interesting is if you think the sort of the stew of University of Chicago, basically from that 20s, 30s period through that late 50s period, so much thought that we take for granted now in terms of human behavior, psychology, neuroscience, sociology, that stuff was bubbling up there. And it's so interesting that while the founders of Second City weren't necessarily tying together their classes with Martin Buber with the work they were doing on a stage, because again, University of Chicago had no theater department. These folks were making theater at a place that had no theater department. But it is, the lineage is there, and we work, as you know, we work a lot with the behavioral science community now because they're recognizing that it isn't like, it's not role playing when we're talking about practicing. What we're down is we're breaking down in these exercises point of focus, listening, status, all the sort of elements, unconscious bias, all these elements that make up how we communicate, how we behave, how we make decisions. And we know, I mean, the yes and concept is actually perfect for understanding this. So most people know about that, right? They've heard it. It's almost a bumper sticker now, this idea in improv that you shouldn't say no, you say yes and. But if you look at it through the lens of, say, behavioral economics, where we know that people's default position is to say no or do nothing, then you could look at yes and say, oh, that's a nudge. That's simply a nudge to get someone off their couch, not watching Netflix, and do something. Or in the case of a business meeting, not shut down a conversation too early. And yes and isn't about like, oh, we have to follow every single thread every single time. It's about, yeah, you want to do that for the first 20 minutes, or you might want to do that for the first few weeks of a process to kind of make sure you've got all the ideas on the table. The idea in creativity, of course, is you cannot be creative if you're in judgment of self or judgment of others. You also can't be creative if you're in fear. And all of that is affected by people saying no to us. So when you create a space, and this is what we do when we're putting together a Second City show over like a 12-week process. First 3 weeks, 4 weeks, all yes and. Every idea, I don't care how dumb it is. Because you don't know what innovation looks like when you're being creative, and creativity and innovation are two different things. When you're being creative, you are just playing and you're failing and it's all good. When you get to innovation, right, you're turning it into something. But by virtue of it being innovative, it means we haven't seen it before. So if you're saying no to these things because they seem like they might not work, you're kind of being both anti-creative and anti-innovation. And so all of that is at play in a variety. I mean, there are thousands of these exercises that address all these different kind of phenomenon. It's really kind of remarkable. And I think we're very lucky that we're turning 65 next year. And we're very lucky that in many ways we didn't know how powerful this stuff would be off the stage. We just thought it was powerful on the stage. So we had so much time to sort of stew and get our expertise and figure out what we really think, what works and what doesn't. And so that now we're sort of able to work with all these major university partners and give MBA students an opportunity to use these exercises themselves to get better at telling the story of themselves and the thing they're trying to sell, for example.
And there's so much gold in here. And I want to pause on the skill building and some of the practices. So let's come back around to that, but maybe let's just segue into the thought that you're just leading with is that, when people think about leadership and collaboration and teamwork, I doubt that many of us go to comedy to think about best practices.
Right.
And so how does improv and the yes and framework help us in these three areas? And those are leadership, collaboration, and teamwork.
Okay. I have a funny story that we'll talk about leadership. So I had a truly terrible idea for a show. It was called Jusical the Musical. I was trying to nail down a certain segment. And so I reached out to the Spertus Institute of Jewish Learning in Chicago, got introduced to the CEO there, Hal Lewis, and said, hey, could we test out some material and from your audience? I've got this idea. He thought also it was a good idea, so we were both wrong. This thing was a disaster. However, he said, okay, great, I'll give you a stage, try some stuff out. Could you also lead some workshops? Big comedy fan, love Second City. And so we're at his venue, and we're observing a workshop, and one of our instructors is doing a classic improv exercise called Follow the Follower. And the idea there is we gather people in a space, and we're just like, okay, right now you're not going to use words. We all want you to walk around the space. We're going to choose one of you to be the leader. We're not going to tell the others that person is leader. That person's job is to use their own body, not words, to hand off leadership to someone else. So whether it's like a nod or whatever, and they have to make sure the person receives it, and then that person does it as well. And Hal Lewis is sitting next to me, and he goes, "You're doing Peter Drucker." And I said to him, "Who's Peter Drucker?" And so I didn't have a computer handy, but he's a quite famous Austrian management theorist who came up with a bunch of brilliant ideas that no one paid attention to. One of which was, and this is the 50s or 60s, right? That command and control leadership doesn't work. And that really this idea of knowledge workers and support and coaching and basically what we were doing in this exercise, which is in improv, what we know is that leadership will change hands continually based on who has the ball and who's the expert in that moment. We've all heard the phrase, your team is only as good as its weakest member. At our place, we say your team is only as good as its ability to compensate for its weakest member, because each of us will be the weakest member at some point. If you have a tech problem or a math problem, please do not come to me. But if you would like to discuss the Grateful Dead or have me order a good wine, I can do that. And I have other things I can do. But that is true of all of us. So our differences as an ensemble, and that's what we call our teams at Second City, ensembles, is that we're all bringing this weird mix of talents, and we are allowing each other's talents to shine and then recede and shine and recede, and there's flow that exists inside of this. So the leadership thing, and this sort of came late because collaboration and teamwork, that's the easy thing to see at Second City, right? It is, how do you think 6 people with 0 script 12 weeks later can end up with award-winning comedy reviews? We are the only theater that I know in the world that is commercially successful only doing original work. Right? Think about this. It's not. There's not a theater that's like, oh yeah, no, we're going to do more new plays. The new plays are going to sell everything. It's no, they right. Got to do Cats. They've got to do It's a Wonderful Life or Christmas Carol. You know, even the cutting edge theaters end up doing, the Who's Tommy or whatever. Not us. Every show is original, and that is 65 years of sold out houses.
Dang. So, and there's something magical about watching net new. Yeah. And so when you're in the audience, you're experiencing the spontaneity and the clumsiness and the having each other's back in an interesting way. I think people are craving that. Yeah. And in my line of work, obviously we talk about team a lot, but when you double click on team, it really is the mechanics of being a great teammate.
Yes.
And what does it take to be a great teammate? And everything that I hear you talking about is just that, so much so that that's one of the reasons that when Tina Fey leaves, she brings people with her because she's like, listen, I know they've got my back.
Right.
And I've got their back. And we've practiced that being a great teammate for a long time. And again, I'll kind of round this out. We've practiced it in an embodied way.
Yes.
So we haven't just done the intellectual exercise of like, hey, if I go sideways on this meeting, will you have my back? It's like, no, they're actually practicing it on a regular basis. And so, all right, now with that in mind, the yes and, the yes and piece here, the framework of yes and, maybe I can't imagine, but there's maybe a handful of people that don't know what yes and means.
Right.
So let's go straight into that.
Sure.
And just open that up. And maybe, I don't know, this is really dangerous, but maybe we could role play it. As I say that out loud, I'm like, oh, Jesus, what did I just say? But but maybe explain what the yes and is.
Sure. Well, let me I'll give you an example of how this played out on the very first day that we started a partnership. So it was about 7 years ago at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. At that time, the Center for Decision Research was run by Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize-winning economist, not then, but after. And he greenlit this program. So essentially, for about 5 years, the Second City sort of improv experts and scientists from the University of Chicago looked at behavioral science through the lens of improvisation and vice versa. Very first day, we are sitting around a table and we said, well, we need an open space. So we go to an open space. And the scientist said, can you just teach us an exercise, like one of your most popular exercises? So we taught them the yes and exercise. So I'll explain what that is. We pair up people, and we had all the scientists pair up. And we said, okay, this day has been amazing. So we're plotting a reunion event for a year from now. And person A, you're going to pitch your ideas for this reunion event to person B. Person B, your job is to say no to every single idea in as many different ways as you would like to go. And they do that for about a minute. And you can imagine that doesn't feel great for person A. It shouldn't feel good for person B. It sometimes does, and that's a problem. So then we say, okay, person B, your turn. And you're going to pitch your ideas. And person A, what you're going to respond to is yes, but. So you're going to say yes, but to every idea. And what inevitably happens after a minute or so of doing this is we poll the room and we say, who liked that better? Half the hands go up. Who thought it was worse? The other half go up. And we're like, yeah, because you heard a yes, but it was a no with a bow tie. It was a no with a top hat. There was no yes there. You got the shiv afterwards. So some people figured that out, and other people were like, oh, I said yes. And then we say, okay, now person A and person B, you're each going to pitch your ideas, and every idea you're going to yes and. You're going to affirm the idea and contribute a new idea. You're not going to negate anything. And we're like, look, and the law of physics doesn't apply. There is no budget. You have whatever budget. You could be having sushi on the moon. And that's what they do. And so the room fills with laughter, and we come around, we're like, okay, what are you doing? And it's amazing what people come up with. And this is about the marketplace of ideas. And the thing is, there's been research on this. I think Bob Sutton's done some at Stanford, which is to get to a good idea, you need something like 2,000 ideas. And I know that sounds daunting. It is not. If you just let your mind go, and again, like if you think like you're creating a Second City show, it's like it can be a premise, it can be a character, it can be an idea, it can be a line, it can be a color, it can be a place, it can be a time. So suddenly they're right there, and then you can make those categories, and you can have 50 under each of those, and suddenly you're at the 2,000, and it's fine. And so generating a lot of ideas, and the research I've looked at around when we talk about mastery in music and in different arts is volume. I mean, the amount of music that the Beatles made in like a 9-year period is stunning. Very similar to Beethoven and Mozart. And, the greats produced a lot. And we don't talk about the stuff that maybe they produced that wasn't great, because it doesn't matter, because a lot of the greatness came out of the a lot. So yes and is an approach to additive creativity. It is, you'll never hear professional improvisers use the term yes and, but is the mindset of, I'm going to go in this room and I am going to allow every idea to live a little. I'm going to explore these ideas. I'm going to add to them. If they take us nowhere, that's fine. We'll go down another path. And we say in our work, you have to learn to replace blame with curiosity. So this idea of like, it's so easy to come in and be like, I've just been handed this terrible thing. But why not go in and go, okay, I've been handed this thing. What can I make of it? We learn to see all obstacles as gifts. In improvisation, we talk about that all the time.
Where does yes and come from? What is the origin of it? Is it you?
It's not me.
No.
I luckily got to write the book. But no, I think, and I don't know that it comes from Spolin either. Some people have credited it to Del Close. It existed when I started at Second City, and it existed before, and it became an idea that just sort of made sense to the work, and it's kind of rule number one. And I think that's probably because what we recognize with individuals is this stuff to get up and you've sort of seen the studies on fear of public speaking being like one of the biggest fears that human beings have. So yep. I would imagine if you don't have a script or anything, or you don't know what you're going to do, and you can't, because when you're improvising, you're just working with whatever you have in the room at the moment. There may be a suggestion, there may not be a suggestion. That seems incredibly daunting. So you really have to teach people the approach to make it not so daunting. So a lot of that in very early improv classes is meditative qualities of getting that place of like, get out of your fear brain. We have them sort of fail over and over and over again. And then we work a lot on listening skills. So if you wanted to play an exercise, actually, you and I could do a very early stage exercise, which is all about that listening, and it's called Last Word. And the idea here is that we're going to have a conversation like we're having right now, and there's one rule, is when I stop talking, the first word of your response to me has to start with the last word I just said, and vice versa.
Cool. Okay. And there's no other rules?
No.
All right. Who goes first?
I'll go first. I was very much looking forward to this conversation because you were gracious enough to come on my podcast. And I think we instantly sort of were like, oh, there are surprising connections between what you do and what I do.
Do I give you that impression that what we're doing is corollary between the two of us?
Us, for sure. Because, I've read your work and I've listened to your podcast, and I am a giant fan of sport. And I've always felt that this world, this sort of improv world, is for the people who didn't have team experience like I did playing soccer, which is my sport, but they needed a team experience.
Experience, like really, when you get down into it, it's reference points and experience that really provides the context for mastery. And I listen to your stories and I listen to your insights, and not only are you studying it, but you're actually living it through Second City, through dishwashing, all the way into managing the plate. Like, you're definitely in it.
Yeah, it's important. What I discovered, and it was through writing the book, right? So we got this book contract, and I would write in the morning. I'd close my door in my office. I never used to close my door. Close my door in my office, and I would write in the morning because I get here early. I'm still the first person here every day, and I'd be done by around 10. And what I noticed was my staff, the people who immediately worked for me, just filled my calendar at 10 o'clock for conversations to have with me. And I later found out what they realized was because I'm not an improviser myself. I didn't come into this as an actor. I was a writer, but I've really worked at the applied ideas. So thinking about this work and then how it applies places. But my staff figured out that because I was writing about the work and the exercises, I was in such a good improvisational headspace that they knew I'd be a really good listener at 10:01 when my door was back open. I became kind of the mediocre boss I was normally later in the day, but it was that sort of fresh off the good ideas of how to listen, how to collaborate, how to co-create, that made me kind of a better human.
Human.
We can stop there.
Yeah, we can stop. Yeah, I was gonna leave you with like two things just for fun for that. I was like, I got to really dial up the listening. Mm-hmm. So point well made. And then so as soon as like I listened to the last word, then I figured out the first sentence, and then I could go kind of just about anywhere. And then at the same time, I was thinking about the handoff.
Yes.
And like, what's the word I wanted to leave with
mm-hmm.
to give you an assist?
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to leave you with, on this last one, Nunya. And it's just because my son keeps like, I'll say, hey, Grayson is his name. Like, hey, Grayson, how's practice? And he said, Nunya, Dad. I go, Nunya?
What does that mean?
Yeah, Nunya business.
Oh, Nunya business.
And he just laughs.
Oh, that's
so I was going to see where you go with Nunya.
Well, I think
so. Anyways,
there's a few things going on there, right? Which is, yes, you you have to listen to the end of my sentence, which most human beings don't do. We think we get the gist, and so we're kind of like, and we don't want to look. We want to look our smartest selves, right? So we're sort of preparing what's the clever thing I can add in. When you're on stage improvising with someone else, the last few words they say might contain crucial information. Of course, that's the same in real life, but we have shortcuts, and we have shortcuts for a reason, right? These biases are built in to keep us safe, and also because the world is complex, and if we pay attention to everything, we're going to go out of our minds. But many conversations that we have throughout the day, we're not giving our full weight to, and so when you practice listening to the end of a sentence, and when you are patient and not worried about the pause at the end, that's the other thing, right? A lot of people feel like, well, if I pause, that's going to be upsetting. It's like, it's the opposite. When I finished talking and I saw you sort of trying to calculate what you were doing, I knew you had been paying attention to me. I knew you saw me, and that felt good. So it's kind of the opposite of the way a lot of people enter these rooms.
Yeah, that's really fun. That's really fun. I would like to go into, you've written about the core principles of improv.
Yeah.
So I do want to go there with you because I think there's a nice segue. However, before we hit that, Robin Williams, Tina Fey, Jon Favreau.
Yeah.
You had mentioned public speaking being so terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And it is one of the things that we're tackling, we're squaring up with in the book that we just wrote that's about FOPO.
Yeah.
And we call it the book title, I don't know if I shared this with you on your podcast, is The First Rule of Mastery.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially it's squaring up with this deep fear that we have of being critiqued and judged, and this chronic desire to see if we're okay based on what you or others might be thinking about us. And it's this constant chronic scanning to see if we're okay that is just exhausting. But public speaking is like culprit number one for FOPO.
Yeah.
And FOPO keeps us from going for it because we're overly trying to manage approval and rejection. And so with Tina and Jon and the folks you've been talking about, did they have any FOPO? How did they work with FOPO? How did you see FOPO in these folks?
Well, yeah. I think a lot of people come to improvisation because they're experiencing some sort of break. It can be a break up. It could be they don't know what they want to do with their life. It could be, a lot of pain, a lot of tragedy, a lot of trauma. Stephen Colbert lost his dad and brothers to a horrible plane accident. Tina Fey, when she was a little girl, doorbell rang, she opened the door, and someone slashed her face, and she has a scar. And she sees herself or saw herself as a deformed human being. That's what she has said in the past. So, and that story goes on and on and on. And so they enter this world of improvisation in part because what they discover is these spaces that they occupy when they're taking classes and then when they do it professionally are they have to be deeply, fiercely present in the moment. They can't linger in the past, and they can't linger in an imaginary future. They have to stay present. One of the things we say is you need to learn to play the scene you're in, not the scene you want to be in. So what is the scene you're in? Play that. And it is incredibly freeing. There are no phones. You have your other humans working with you. And in the classes, we are putting people up to fail in volume over and over and over again. There's a classic game called 1001, and it's basically you throw out an object. Give me an object like plunger, and then there's a format for a joke. 1001 plungers walk into a bar. Bartender says, "We don't serve your kind." The plungers say, stick it or whatever. Some stupid, joke like I just made. It was terrible. And you just have to keep getting it. You have to keep getting it. And what happens is the rule for the rest of the group is no matter how bad your joke is, they have to applaud like it's the funniest thing they've ever heard. And so you're building up like a callus for your bad failing work. And this is there's so many of these exercises, but they're about this is the batting average. I think we might have talked about this. If we didn't, I use this when I talk in my speeches all the time, which is, Nick Epley is one of the scientists that we work with at the University of Chicago, and he has research that shows us that human beings get it right in typical conversations probably 20 to 30% of the time. So 30% being kind of generous, right? And then you're just missing stuff. You just are. And if you think about that in the context, if it surprises you, and you think about that in the context of a major league baseball player at at home plate batting, if he's missing the ball 70% of the time, he's a 300 hitter. It's pretty good. So that's idea really of being, yeah. and that's, what they've done is they've taken a lot of swings and missed. So that,
Wait a minute. So go back to Nicholas's insight is that we're getting conversations about 20% right?
20 to 30% right, that we're understanding what's going on inside the conversation, understanding the full intent of what the person is trying to convey to us at any given moment.
I had no idea. I'm Nicholas Epley, Chicago. I know his work, so I didn't know this. This is, I'm going to go dig in. That's really terrible.
Yeah,
that's disheartening.
It is. But it's also funny. So Epley has this joke in his book Mindwise, which I highly recommend. He's got this great joke which is a man walks up to a riverbed and he sees another man on the other side and he yells to him, "How do I get to the other side of the river?" And the man yells back, "You are on the other side of the river."
Yeah, right.
That's the world we live in. And again, not surprising if you take a beat and just, if you go online or read a newspaper, it's like the framing is terrible all the time. And there's always framing. And context is so hugely important, yet we don't necessarily always consider context. So when you understand that we're getting it wrong more than we're getting it right considerably, what an awesome opportunity for you to listen a little bit more deeply, ask a couple more questions, do all those things that might give you an edge in notching that up to 35 or 40%. And I would say that great improvisers are understanding what's going on in a conversation or a room much more than a regular human being. And it's in the same way that great athletes know to move to space. This is such a soccer thing, but I think it's true with the other sports, certainly basketball. But that idea of like, no, like you just got like, how is Messi passing it there? Like he just knows you should go to that space. And I grew up with the championship Bulls teams, thank God, here in Chicago, and just watching the flow of those folks once they got the triangle. And they just started figuring out how this works. It was beautiful to watch. It was like ballet, like some form of dance. And there's synchrony that happens, right? And that's, you want to avoid group think so you can get to group mind. How do we all sort of think the same in a way that will guide us in our individual work and our individual skill? And that is a hard thing to achieve, but I would imagine is the thing that ties together championship teams across all the different sports.
Well, when you said group mind, I want to make sure I'm hearing that correctly, because I hear group mind and I go to group flow.
Yeah,
and
I think I mean group flow. The distinction I want to say is it's not group think. It is not.
That's right. Yeah, that's
it
right.
is not that.
Yep.
because that's a danger, but it is about
group mind is a cool. Yeah, that is cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think that group flow it's probably happening on stage if we're thinking about the same thing, like whether it's 2 people or 3 people. And I'm nodding my head confusedly, thinking that group flow is one of the unlocks for great teams.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of science around flow, and there's less science around group flow.
Yes.
And I would imagine that fear and risk are part of those triggers and I know it's one of your principles for improv, but fear and risk are they're a forcing function to be all in to this moment.
Yeah.
And if you can't embrace the fear with deep focus and listening and take the risk of staying in the next moment too, then the whole thing does unravels because you've ejected out of what's required to stay on time. Maybe I can say that better. You've ejected out when what is required is to stay on time.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to hear your take on this.
Sure. So there's a phrase in our work of the need to follow the fear. And there's a teacher, he was an actor here first, then a teacher, Rick Thomas, who used to say, you need to learn to fall into the crack of the game. I'll say it again. You need to learn to fall into the crack of the game. And the idea there is like, these mistakes and these fears are all opportunities. And I not to get too, erudite, but it's not unconnected to Kierkegaard's existential leap of faith, which was also not unconnected to the term beat generation, which was coined by John Cleland Holmes, not Kerouac, but Kerouac built off it. And all of that is about when you're in this beaten space, but it's also beatific. And this idea of I'm leaping into the unknown. It's those that's where all the good stuff is. And it's hard, but it's easier if you got a group. It's easier if you're not alone. And you're right, it hasn't been studied because when you're doing legit scientific studies, you need to have volume. And the way to really understand this kind of group flow is following 6 people who are putting up a Second City show for a year and a half. And that hasn't happened yet. I keep trying because I do think that that's where they're going to discover this idea, because we're ruthlessly experimenting in front of audiences. We're doing rapid prototyping of creativity in front of audiences, this third act of improvisation. And when we're in a process for creating a show, and this is very risky, right? Is that we are just, that third act is just all made up. But understanding if you're going to have your people have that element of risk, you need to protect them. So you've heard the term psychological safety. The environment that is set for this third act is all about setting that sort of psychological safety. It's free. So anyone coming off the street can come to the improv set. When we end the 2-act show, we take our bows, and the cast is, they're in their nice clothes and they're taking their bows, and they go, well, we're thinking about doing a little bit more. Would you want to stay? So it's almost an apology that they're saying. And then when they come back, they're usually dressed down. They might be in jeans, they might be in other stuff, and it's late at night, and there's drinking. So you have all these cues that are set up to like, let's all just kind of loosen back and play and see what happens. And it's people's favorite part of the evening. But it is by far the riskiest and the least successful if you use the metric of laugh, because there's going to be groan when stuff doesn't work. But it was set up right. The founders of Second City instinctively understood this idea that we need a safe space to play and to risk. And this is the thing that businesses need. If they're in the business of making something out of nothing, creating new things, all of that. Where is their laboratory for people to play? And especially what we understand now in almost all businesses is you can't do it in a silo, and that you want to use your audience. So how do you engage them in such a way that's not going to put it at risk your product or the thing that might not work? And that's not always easy, but I think great businesses have found a way to find that space of play for themselves.
Do you think that's why teams in business don't operate as teams, is because they haven't built that play unstructured way that they are taking care of each other?
There's a great quote I came across the other day, and it was from Francis Fry and Ann Morris, who have a terrific new book. And we
had them on the pod. They're
awesome, right? But I think the line that I really respond to is that a bad system beats a great person any day of the week. And I think that, you can teach your people to all these great skills, but if you don't have a system in which they can then do this work, then it ain't going to work. So I think it's less about necessarily the individual team as what's the system they're operating in. Are they given a level of autonomy and freedom and opportunity? Are they given a lot of instruction and knowledge ahead of time? This is the thing about improvisation, is it may seem like we're talking about just making it up. There are so many rules and so many conditions and so many walls, very specific walls. That stage is a specific size, and we're doing this work at a specific time, and then we stop doing the work at a specific time, and then there's note sessions, and there's all these things surrounding it, because you want to have all that information this is like, Charlie Parker, the great saxophonist, wouldn't be able to do the incredible improvisation that he became known for if he couldn't have played Bye Bye Blackbird note for note beautifully. So it's that tension, right?
Yes. So from form to break form is something that I've picked up from the arts that really has stuck with me. Like, you gotta be rock solid on form to be able to break form.
Yeah.
And same with structure. No structure to break structure.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a play on words, no structure to no structure, but K-N-O-W to N-O-W.
Yeah, I love that.
Or N-N-O, yeah. And okay, so do you think that the switch that would need to take place in business is more suited for an entrepreneur startup, where it's like, we're going to create a whole new way of operating? Or do you think that it's small little incremental changes that would take place at the multinationals that would allow those enterprises to be able to get a bit more psychological safety, a bit more structure to play, a bit more practice on taking care, a bit more awareness on how to actually fail and fail fast and fail well and fail forward and all those things?
Yes. I think it's
what do you think?
Yeah. I think it's easy to see the analogy to startups, because having worked in theater my whole life, not just improvisational theater, but theater writ large, the best training, and most startups people who work in startups will tell you this, the best training would be putting on a play, putting on a show, because you have to do everything. What is the play? What are you calling it? Where are you doing it? How are you doing it? How are you selling tickets? How are you promoting it? Then it's got to go on. There's got to be lights. There's got to be a stage. There's got to be sound. All this stuff. The multinationals are the people who hire Second City to come in and work with them, because they recognize that they want their teams to be more effective. And there are places like IDEO and other businesses. Zappos has a yes and library. They've embraced this idea within their team. So there are many organizations. Anyone who's doing agile, that whole idea around Scrum Masters and sprints and all that, very improvisational, like design thinking, very improvisational. So it's out there under other names. It's out there under improv. And I think it's becoming increasingly, when I started here, so again, late 80s, but then in the 90s, when I was starting, I was running things and working with the leadership team, we had to do so much convincing to the Fortune 500s to hire us to do work. That's done. That's not the problem anymore. The problem might be budget. The problem might be time, or what to focus on, or how to focus on, all those things. But it's like people get it now. And I think and now that more and more studies are being done and coming out about this particular form of improvisation and how it's been used in these different domains, that path is just going to become easier and easier and easier. The work itself is hard because it does demand both these individual sort of human practice that happens, and then the greater system by which these teams are allowed to operate in ways that they can be successful. And that's not the model Jack Welch was talking about at GE.
How would you suggest a startup or a multinational start in like practicing this? And I mean, the easiest thing that I think of is the problem, which is people that are no buts or yes buts. You know, that's an easy one that I think you can knock the calcium off that. And the other one is when people know the yes and idea, but it comes off as dismissive anyway.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's like yes and then it's orthogonal and to the original idea. It's not actually a build. It's like an assertion of their first idea that they are just kind of trying to ramrod through. Like how would you help create? I want to push back on the safe space, but I want to stay there for a minute. How would you help create that safe space to practice yes and, or to practice being a great teammate to have each other's back?
Well, I want to acknowledge a thing that you just said, which I think is very true, which is Nir Eyal is a guest I had on the podcast, and he has a phrase that it's not a superpower unless it can also be used for evil. So yes and can absolutely be used for evil in just the way you were saying it, by just saying it, but not doing it at all, and discounting it. And there are people who do that. If you have an experienced improvisational educator, such that come out of Second City and that come out of other places as well, working with one team at a time, because this is the thing, man. I want us to change the world. It's not going to happen one person at a time, and it's not going to happen en masse. The only place it can happen is team by team by team by team. And we all work in some level of team at some point. So I would say to any business, it's like, start with a team. Start with one team and see what happens when these people are trained, and then get let loose inside your company. Measure it. It's going to be better. So we talked about psychological safety. Do you know that origin story of Amy Edmondson when she was the postdoc and worked at the hospital, where this whole idea came from?
No.
It's amazing. So people know the term psychological safety probably because Google did a thing called Project Aristotle, looking for the top quality of good teams. And psychological safety came out number one. This idea of creating a space in which you feel safe to make mistakes. So Amy Edmondson was actually studying as a postdoc at Harvard, and Richard Hackman was her advisor. And a hospital was having some difficulty with a study they were working on. Hackman was too busy, recommended Amy follow up on it. And the data she was getting was pretty troubling. So they were studying these nursing pods, these groups of nurses, and it was kind of clear that the nurses who were kind of the meanest and toughest to each other, they had the least mistakes in the data. And the nurses who were kind and empathetic with each other, they had the most mistakes. And this was like backwards from what everyone's thinking was at the time of like, well, no, like if you're mean to each other, that's going to cause more problems, and then the opposite. And, Amy was really worried because like, this is my first big study and I'm blowing it and it's going to be a failure. And so she had sort of an insight when she got taken to this dark space that maybe something else was happening that the data wasn't telling them. And she convinced the hospital to hire a third party to observe what was going on. And this person didn't know what the study was about. They were just there to observe these nursing pods and report back what was happening. And after 2 weeks, the report was kind of stunning, because what they discovered was it wasn't that the sort of mean, non-collaborative nursing pods were making the least mistakes. They were reporting the least mistakes.
Oh.
And the opposite was true of the collaborative, cooperative people who, because they were reporting the most mistakes, they wouldn't make those same mistakes in the future. That's psychological safety.
That's great. Because the thing that I would say after reading some of that research, not knowing the origin story, is psychological safety is great. Yet. Yes. And, for what aim is the thing that I always make sure that we are agreeing on.
That's right.
This is not therapy at work.
Right.
This is to create enough space that you can raise your hand and say, I made a mistake, or I fundamentally disagree, or this is actually, there's some danger in this, like it's to create that space that you can get in the messy middle and be honest with it.
Yeah.
And so,
because you don't want the mistake on opening night, and you don't want the mistake in the Super Bowl.
I see.
But we are going to make mistakes. So if you are in your training, in the times when the stakes are low, allow people to sort of, practice those mistakes. I just interviewed Sally Jenkins, the terrific Washington Post sports columnist who wrote that great Martina Navratilova, Chris Everett article that came out a couple of weeks ago. And I hadn't realized the kind of, first of all, Michael Phelps, she talks about him and his coaching. And I didn't realize, really, I don't think I paid attention to all his level of social anxiety, but also what the coach would do with him, which is he was real scared of getting water in his goggles. So they practiced him getting water in his goggles. I'm like, that's, and you talk about this, in your work too.
Yeah, well,
it's brilliant.
Bob Bowman is his coach.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so they talked about the practice of imagery about that. And we even got down, Bob was on the podcast as well. We talked about the relationship between seeing success and seeing mistakes.
Yes.
And so we were, oddly enough, like we didn't know each other for a long time. And he was doing the 80-20 and I was doing a 85-15. So 85% of the time seeing success, exactly how you hope it will go, laying that neurological pathway. And then 15% of the time seeing it go sideways and then figuring out spontaneously how to fix it.
That's right.
In while you're in it. And so back to your point though.
Yeah. Simply that, this isn't easy. Like being a human being is not easy. And I'm 50. I just turned 57. Had a birthday last week. I am sorry to say this. It does not get easier. It really doesn't. Your body starts to break down. You lose people. You lose more people. You lose pets. Work gets harder in all these ways. However, if you have a practice, and I do, we're talking about it, and hopefully some wisdom, and you continue to allow yourself to be curious, you are going to have so much an incredible toolbox from which to deal with all this.
You've had trauma in your life. And we've been talking about, the Yes and framework for teamwork, collaboration, and building trust. Can you maybe share how this framework, how you used it or how it presented being useful with your mom and your daughter? And maybe you can open up for the audience that doesn't know that part of your life.
So it actually, the story started before, and Adam Grant gave me a call, and he's the Wharton professor, and I've been interviewed for like 3 or 4 of his books, and I ended up in none of them. So, but he's a friend, and he had a friend moving to Chicago. Her name was Ai-jen Poo, and he said, "Would you meet with her?" And I'm like, "Of course, I'm going to meet with her." And Ai-jen was the executive director of a group called Caring Across Generations, as well as the National Domestic Workers Alliance. She was a MacArthur Genius grantee and like the best human being in the world. We hit it off, and we ended up co-creating, my wife Ann and I, with Ai-jen and her team, co-creating an improvisation for caregivers program. We collaborated with the Cleveland Clinic, and it was basically, we're going to take the behavioral science that we're doing and the improvisation, and we're going to center it in this care experience, whether it's you caring for your mom with Alzheimer's, or whether it's you in a hospital setting. And one of the things, my mom got Alzheimer's, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and I knowed it, and I blocked it. And I didn't recognize that you could use this power of yes and to navigate really successfully, mostly successfully, that relationship. And then where this really hit home is when our daughter Nora got diagnosed with cancer when she was 16, and this was 5 years ago, and it was in her liver and lungs, and suddenly we're at the Lurie Children's Hospital here in Chicago, and we used everything. So here's an exercise so there's an exercise based on Nick Epley's work that we talked about. And we talked about the fact that, Epley says people get it wrong a lot. And one of the reasons that they get it wrong a lot is because we as individuals are oddly reluctant to share personal details about ourselves. And this is even sort of low stakes stuff. So Anne, my wife, created this exercise called Universal Unique. And we pair two people up and we give them a banal topic like grocery shopping. We say, okay, person A, describe how human beings grocery shop, just everyday human beings. And they do that for a minute and it's boring. And we say, okay, take a beat. And I want you to think about how you personally grocery shop. Now do that. Completely different. And when you break it down, people are like, I learned about them. I relate to them. I understand something about their values. And this is from grocery shopping. So when we're in the hospital with Nora, and you get these new nurses and new doctors continually throughout even a day, and then new people the next day. And we wanted them to see her and see us and not just a disease. And so I used this, and a new person would come in the room. I'd say, hey, I'm Kelly. This is Anne. We've both worked at Second City for over 30 years. This is Eleanor. She also goes by Nora. And we have a 100-pound Bernese mountain dog named Benchley, who's an asshole. Who are you? And they would tell us. And suddenly it wasn't cancer, it was Nora. And suddenly it was like, oh, Kelly and Anne. And I remember one doctor, we were home sometimes, at the hospital and at home. That's just so complex. And, like the temperature was up, so we called. And I remember when he said, come in, we'll check you in. And he said, when it was you who was calling, I kind of knew, well, if Kelly and Anne are calling, it's probably right that they come in, because he knew us. And the thing is, we're on this floor 17 at Lurie, with all these kids with cancer. And there are so many kids who either don't have a parent who's advocating for them or can be there, or a parent who's just so scared they don't know what to say, or they want to be completely deferential, and I understand that. But everyone's going to make mistakes, and we all are in this together. We're in this soup together. And so we utilize this to create, a team of caregivers, an incredible team. We lost Nora 4 years ago. It was about a year. And that's a whole other thing, man. That's this idea of, okay, and I will tell you the thing that if there's one aspect of this work that through the sort of grief period that helped me, it was the idea of relationship, right? That in improvisation you have your ensemble, but your ensemble isn't just the people on stage with you. It includes that audience, and it includes the people who are cleaning up the room and the box office. And that's the way it has always been at Second City. We make heroes of the audience, and in turn they make heroes of us. And that's what I needed. So I think it would have been very easy to just like go hide in a hutch somewhere. And instead, we rallied the team and to hold us up when we couldn't hold up ourselves, and they did it. It's still hard, it's not the scene I want to be in, but we had to play the scene we were in.
Mm. How much of you now, after what I would consider being one of the hardest things a human goes through is losing their child, how much of you is honestly like revealing all of who you are, and how much now post this grief and loss are holding back who you are?
Yeah.
And I feel like that type of, all trauma, we swing one way or the other. It's either like, fuck it, here I am, or it's like, you're not getting me because that shit's too painful.
That's right.
So how did you swing?
So I've always lived out loud. My wife less so, much more of an introvert. I've always been an extrovert. I'm that on steroids now. I have no room for small talk. And the other thing is, I kept a Caring Bridge journal through the entire experience and for a year after she passed. And so,
what is that? What's a Caring Bridge
So
journal?
one of the wonderful things that exists out there in the world is this website called Caring Bridge. And if you're ill or you have a loved one who's ill, you can update what's going on in sort of a blog form, and people can then communicate with you. And if you've got a GoFundMe, you can have a link there, and there's it's wonderful. Like millions of people who signed on to our Caring Bridge, who strangers. Who would reach out and either ask how she was doing or after she passed and sort of checking in. And I wrote about everything. And then what I discovered, because I had done this as a way to help me, this was a selfish, this was the way to make me survive through this thing, is that then people would come up, all kinds of people, and share their trauma. And lo and behold, what I didn't understand and didn't realize is the vast majority of us are holding on to some really dark stuff. That was a surprise to me. So now that I know this, it has changed me immeasurably. I mean, I like who I am more now.
In what ways?
Because it makes, when someone does something that seems weird, bad, whatever, my first instinct is not to yell at them. It's to wonder what pain they have that is making them do that. I find that to be a healthier and more true and human response. And it's not true always, whether it's an illness or something else that someone's lashing out. I'm not Pollyannic about this. I don't think the whole world is out to help everyone. But I think more people are probably good than bad, and we're all both, right? We have moments. I mean, meaning is made in moments. Life's made in moments, and I don't want to be defined by my worst moments. And if there are some that aren't so great, but I really strive for trying to understand and be curious, and then also to show some grace, and that's this idea of, can I take a beat? Can I just take a beat? Try to reassess the situation, try to give some opportunity for whatever bad moment might have just happened to maybe get a little bit better. And inevitably, like a good portion of the time, it does. And that's just, I didn't have that patience before all this. I didn't have the wisdom before this. And I didn't know what I didn't know. And I continue now to know I don't know a lot of things, which is a great burden to take off my shoulders, to not realize I don't need to have it right all the time, because I don't. We have a mutual friend, Scott Barry Kaufman, and he taught he taught me the term post-traumatic growth, and this idea that potentially you could take the worst thing that happened to you and have it affect you in a way that can be positive for yourself and for others. It doesn't make the bad thing not happen. It doesn't mean you're not going to be sad or angry or all those things, but it does give you a frame for moving forward, broken, bruised, battered, but move forward and try to find, joy and flourishing and all the things that we're trying to find, in our lives. And we have a son who's 25 and wants to be an actor and is about to go down to Atlanta to start an apprenticeship with the Shakespeare Theater there. And I want to see him attack that stage, and we have friends, and Anne's got students, and I have colleagues, and there are all these people who are counting on us to bring what we can bring to our various ensembles. And we need them to do the same for us. So I don't know. It's I don't have the answers, but I got a playbook, and luckily it's my life's work.
Whew. I mean, Kelly, thank you for sharing that part of it, your insights and through the pain that you've had, and Thank you for like clarity on the playbook.
Yeah.
And like, we don't have like play 1, 2, 3, 4, lined out here, but that's really what your book is about. And that's why people hopefully can be interested in bringing you out to their organization. And through, we've got a first principle here at Finding Mastery is that through relationships, we become.
Yeah.
And it's the relationships that is at the center of this whole thing. And, it's evident here that improv is more about connection.
Yeah, that's right.
It's more about seeing and listening and having someone's back and trusting that they're going to have your back, far more than it is about comedy.
That's right.
And you're teaching the skills of relationships. You're teaching the skills of connection in an embodied way so people know how to trust it. There's real evidence that they can get on the edge, and then there's somebody else out there with them that's going to be in it and take care of them and do their very best. And like, I'm stoked to have this conversation with you. And I'm like, my heart swells a bit for folks that are feeling that they want to grow, and they know that it's about taking some risks. And this might be a really safe, fun, meaningful way for folks to, So encourage folks to get your book and give you a jingle to come out, and give it a go with the team that they're on. And so where do you, just before we wrap up, I just want to get your hint at the future here. Where do you think comedy and AI, and where do you think tech and connection are taking us?
So here's what
and that's a multi-part question.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that the robots are not particularly good at is improv or comedy. They can tell some bad jokes, but jokes are one thing in comedy, and they're not necessarily what most of us consume, right? I mean, if you think about the comedy you consume, it is the sitcoms and movies and stand-ups, and they tell a lot of stories, and they're talking about their own experiences. My wife is a tenured professor of comedy. She runs the first ever BA in comedy writing and performance at Columbia College. And she talks about, one thing I think that I love that she talks about in the realm of comedy is that in improvisation, we're doing a lot of perspective taking. We are getting suggestions from the audience and taking those suggestions and then spitting back what we think they mean to the audience. Stand-up comedians do, and they have to do, a very different thing. They, and especially in the first 5 minutes of their act, they have to do perspective giving. They have to teach the audience how to watch them. And if you think about your favorite stand-up comedians, that's usually talking about their flaws. Patton Oswalt is a schlub. Amy Schumer is a slut. John Mulaney is a drunk. So keep going. And then from there. And this is a leadership thing, I think, which is like, I don't want your success story. I want your fiasco and the fact that you made it through. So when I think about comedy and improvisation, I think about mess and struggle and hard stuff and the ability to navigate through it and laugh our asses off because we're all kind of just figuring this crazy thing out together. So the future is the blend. The future is not that AI takes the place of. It's that AI is additive to, because you're going to need the storytellers and the problem solvers and the creators. And that is just not going to be that particular kind of technology. And we are going to need deep places of human connection, and the shortest distance between two people is a laugh. So comedians who are already our truth tellers, Colbert, Jon Stewart, Seth Meyers, the late night, which used to be news, I know it's still there, but not in the same way. It's now these comedians who are trying to show us maybe a better way to live. I think all of that sort of coalesces. And I think it's a very powerful concoction when done well. And I think you can see it on the opposite side too. I think you can see how people can use comedy to otherize individuals. I have been asked to come on many a program to talk about whether Trump is funny or not. And indeed, he is using comedy. He is. I think he is using it to make people separate and others and that sort of thing. But it's definitely using.
Wait, how is he using comedy?
Oh, well, I mean, because he is getting us to all the names he calls people. He is an insult comic. He is Don Rickles. insulting people, to have that tribe feel connected by making that other person an out person. They're out of our group, and we're going to laugh at them. As opposed to what we do, which is, how do we bring you in? How do we celebrate the thing that's different about you and we bring you in? So comedy can be used in both ways. It's a very powerful tool. And he has the cadence of a comedian. If you just, it's why, when Patty Cooper, who is a stand-up, who does the sort of lip syncing of Trump, it's the reason that is effective is she is using her frame as a comedy stand-up to simply use his words and facially deliver it in such a way that's like, oh, this is funny. That's what's funny about that.
I see both of those points.
Yeah.
I see both those points. Yeah. And, I guess a light segue here is that I don't know the psychology here, and I'm imagining you might have at least a hint at it, is why we laugh, in dark situations, and like the gift that is, and it's like right at the edge of irreverence and like disrespect.
That's right.
But when you're in it, and like special operators have like this, that type of connection. And if anybody were to hear, we just had two SEALs on, special operators on, and they're like, yeah, if anyone would have heard, what we joked about and laughed about, like we'd be instantly canceled. Yes. But so can you open up a little bit of that, like the dark situation humor? Yeah.
Well, there's a fMRI study that was done fairly recently in China, which exposed that the same region of the brain that processes an insight is the same part that processes a joke. So it is discovery. It is also a mechanism by which we diffuse our apprehension and our fear. So it's in the same way that you're looking at this, what looks like a really sweet behind of a fine lady that you're walking by, and you realize it's a guy. And if you're a cis man like myself, you laugh at it because you're like, uh-oh, what did I do there? And so there's many of those oopsie moments that we all have that then we laugh afterwards, which is really just sort of like, okay, I didn't want to go there in my mind. I went there in my mind. I can acknowledge it now, move past it. Or we use it as a way, which happens in traditional comedy all the time, which is a truth is revealed that you didn't expect inside comedy. So the processing, the understanding of humor, certainly there's philosophers and sociologists and other kinds of scientists who've studied this stuff. My wife has a book coming out next year called Funnier. It's her theory of comedy. And the title is based on dads and moms coming up to her and saying, hey, are you going to make my kid funny? And she goes, I can't make him funny. I can make him funnier. I can take the thing that they have and then push it to the extent that they'll allow me to push it or discover it. And a lot of that is just these skills that we're talking about. But and she has every one of these students they all have a writing practice. They need to observe things in the world. They need to write them down. I mean, we should all be doing this for whatever our jobs are. But like especially the young people who enter her program are what many people define as E2, right? They're terrible on testing and they're all brilliant. And so she has to push them to do this work and really focus and be disciplined so that they can then let their incredibly facile, rebellious minds work in the most positive way possible and entertain us while also giving themselves, a career that they can, buy groceries and pay for rent and insulin and things like that. So
insulin,
yes, all the things that one needs. So I think that's this stuff is it appears to be magic and it ends up not being, and that's okay.
Give us one takeaway, something we can do at the dinner room table besides the universal unique, which is a fun one. Give us one more that we could do at the dinner table. Or
this is based on. So our son Nick was always a natural improviser, very good, could completely yes and through everything. Our dear departed Nora was not, in which she had a thing that Nick I think coined as Noralogs. Which were her own personal monologues where she just wouldn't stop talking. He created a thing called the story bucket. When she had a story that turned into a Noralog, she had to drop it in the imaginary story bucket so that it would never be found again. So we didn't create this. There is an improv exercise that we used at the dinner table. You can also use it in the car with the kids. And it's called one word story. Very simple. You tell a story one word at a time. So everyone just has to say the story, but they can only say one word of the story. And when we get to Nora and she would say hippopotamus when really all that should have been there was a the or an and, it would cause her essentially to lose the game. And she did not want to lose. So she learned how tos, thes, ands, ofs could be very useful at different times. And every once in a while she got to say hippopotamus. And that was a game that allowed her to build the ability to share a conversation.
So you don't know where the story's going to
Nope.
go. And you just like, if you were to say the word today, and then the next person says I, and the next person says went. And so we're just building
a story. And you see where it goes. And it's amazing when it actually kind of all ties together and you just know there's a natural end. It's beautiful. But you can only do that if everyone's listening to the person before, the person after, and is making these.
Wait, how does that work with a cell phone in your hand?
It does not work with a cell phone in your hand.
No, it doesn't.
There's no cell phone to be seen.
All right. Well, listen, Kelly, thank you for teaching us about connection and comedy and improv and creativity and innovation and leadership and teammates, being a great teammate and teamwork. Like, thank you. And I'm stoked that people in our community that might not have known you or Second City now definitely do. And where do we drive people for your book? And where do you want to just kind of suggest people go check out your work?
Yeah, so the book is available everywhere, but Amazon's probably the easiest right now. And then if you come to the Second City website, the Second City Works section is where my podcast is. We're also on WGN Radio. But if you come to the Second City website, you'll see the podcast, and I'm easily found on social, and I'd love to interact with folks, so feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for having me. This has been a blast.
Appreciate you, Kelly.